The United States. A disastrous beta at launch. It logged into the system with only 10% of the map unlocked. And it's insane that this weak, flawed startup has become a global superpower in less than a century. Why? The map of the United States wasn't drawn with a pen. It was drawn with a massive checkbook, a loaded shotgun, and a level of audacity that would make even a modern crypto scammer blush. I am not kidding. We are talking about a nation that bought half a continent from Napoleon for literal pennies, bullied Mexico out of its lunch money, ghosted Native American treaties like a toxic ex, and treated the Wild West like a GTA online lobby with absolutely no moderators. Today, we aren't just looking at maps, we are dissecting the greatest real estate heist in human history. Welcome to Historically Facts. Let's see how the eagle really got its wings. Let's look at the server stats for a second. Today, the United States boasts a population of over 348 million people, with most of them crowded into the eastern half of the map like they are afraid of wide-open spaces. The only other major clusters are clinging to the Pacific coastline in California and Washington, probably just for the beach vibes. But rewind the clock to the year 1800 and the server looked completely dead. Back then, the entire U.S. population was a measly 5.3 million people. That is basically the population of a mid-sized YouTube channel today. And get this, they were all huddled together in just 16 states, terrified to leave the Atlantic Ocean side. To the west lay the Appalachian Mountains, and beyond that, a massive fog of war labeled uncharted wilderness, full of snow-capped mountains, deserts, and thousands of native tribes who had actually been living there for millennia without needing a flag. So, how did the U.S. get the ball rolling? It started with the Treaty of Paris in 1783. After beating Britain in the Independence War, the U.S. unlocked its first map expansion. They inherited the original 13 colonies, plus a massive chunk of land stretching all the way to the Mississippi River. But owning the land on paper and actually living there are two very different things. Enter the beta testers. The most famous one was a guy named Daniel Boone. While everyone else was too scared to cross the mountains, Boone found a glitch in the map called the Cumberland Gap in the late 1760s. He basically cleared the path for future pioneers and set up a settlement called Boonesboro in 1775, proving that you wouldn't immediately die if you went west. To make things official, Congress dropped the Northwest Ordinance Patch in 1787. This was the first organized, incorporated territory, stretching from the Great Lakes down to the Ohio River. It was basically the government saying, okay, the server is stable, you guys can start building bases here. And it worked. A slow trickle of settlers moved in, and soon enough, Kentucky and Tennessee joined the Union in the 1790s. But let's be honest, this was just the tutorial level. The U.S. was still trapped behind the Mississippi River, looking at the rest of the continent with hungry eyes. They needed a way to break the game. And luckily for them, a short French guy named Napoleon was about to make the worst financial decision in history. In 1803, Europe was doing what Europe does best, preparing for a massive war. France, led by Napoleon, was bracing for the Napoleonic Wars, and frankly, they were broke. Napoleon looked at his massive colonial holdings in North America and thought, you know what? I need cash more than I need swamps and mountains. Sensing a desperate seller, the United States swooped in with the ultimate lowball offer. For a grand total of just $15 million, the U.S. completed the Louisiana purchase. To put that into perspective, that is roughly the price of a high-end penthouse in New York City today. But back then, that $15 million bought them an immense swath of land stretching from the Mississippi River all the way to the high peaks of the Rocky Mountains. It effectively doubled the size of the country overnight. It was, without a doubt, the greatest Black Friday deal in geopolitical history. But there was a catch. The U.S. bought the map, but the map was blank. They had no idea what was actually out there. So the following year, President Thomas Jefferson commissioned the ultimate road trip. He sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, along with 40 companions, to basically vlog their journey across the new territory. These guys spent months hiking, canoeing, and trying not to die, finally reaching the Pacific Ocean in 1805. When they came back with their stories and maps, it sparked a brain rot in the American psyche that we now call manifest destiny. Suddenly, every American believed it was their God-given right, nay, their destiny, to dominate the continent from coast to coast. However, believing you own the land and actually surviving on it are two different things. In the 1810s and 20s, the frontier was still a wild, lawless PvP zone that attracted only the desperate or the insane. Enter the mountain men. These were the server's hardcore players. Men like Hugh Glass and Jim Bridger didn't care about building cozy farms. They plied the great rivers as hunters, collecting animal furs, which were the cryptocurrency of the 19th century. These guys played on survival mode, with permadeath turned on. They lived in fortified trading posts that served as the only safe zones in the region. But their grinding paid off. These mountain men gained crucial knowledge of the terrain and waterways. They were the ones who marked the paths that would eventually become the pioneer trails, allowing later waves of normies in wagon trains to attempt the journey to the Willamette Valley in Oregon. They paved the way. But while the U.S. was busy high-fiving itself over its expansion, they were ignoring a very large, very angry neighbor to the south. By the mid-1840s, the United States was suffering from a severe case of main character syndrome. They looked at the map to their southwest and saw a massive chunk of land that technically belonged to Mexico. But in the eyes of the American government, that land wasn't Mexican, it was just future American property that hadn't been liberated yet. This brings us to the saga of Texas. In December 1845, the U.S. annexed the Republic of Texas, making it the 28th state. Now, imagine you have a neighbor who lets you crash on their couch, and a few weeks later, you claim the living room is legally yours. That is basically what happened here. Mexico was, understandably, not thrilled about their territory being swiped. Tensions simmered until May 1846, when the United States officially declared war on Mexico. The narrative was that Mexico was the aggressor, but let's be real, the U.S. was itching for a fight to grab more land. The resulting Mexican-American War lasted almost 2 years, and it ended exactly how the U.S. hoped, with American troops occupying Mexico City in 1847. Defeated, and with a gun to their head, Mexico was forced to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. In diplomatic terms, Mexico ceded land. In reality, they were mugged. The U.S. walked away with an absolutely massive loot box. We are talking about modern-day California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, and Utah. Just like that, the map expanded exponentially. But as the ink was drying on the treaty, something shiny was discovered in the hills of California that would turn the server into absolute chaos. News spread faster than a conspiracy theory on Twitter. Suddenly, tens of thousands of people, known as the 49ers, abandoned their boring lives in the East to rush California in 1849. By the mid-1850s, over 300,000 people had flooded the region. Boom towns like Deadwood and Tombstone popped up overnight, filled with saloons, gambling dens, and brothels. But here is the funny part. Most of the prospectors didn't get rich. The real winners were the entrepreneurs who sold overpriced shovels and whiskey to the idiots digging in the dirt. It was the classic mine the miners strategy. But not everyone moved west for greed. Some just wanted to rage quit the toxic server in the east. Enter the Mormons. After facing persecution back home, their guild leader, Brigham Young, decided in the late 1840s that they needed their own private base. Over the next 20 years, about 70,000 Mormons trekked to Utah to build the Salt Lake Valley. They looked at a barren desert and said, "Yep, this is the place." Meanwhile, in the Central Plains, a new character class unlocked: the cowboy. Huge herds of cattle needed to be moved from Texas to the north, creating the archetypal symbol of the American West. But let's be real, being a cowboy wasn't all high-noon duels. It was mostly walking behind cows for hundreds of miles. To make all this movement easier, the government decided to unlock fast travel. In 1862, they passed the Homestead Act, literally giving away land for $1. 25 an acre to anyone willing to farm it. It was the original "it's free real estate" meme. Then came the ultimate game changer, the Transcontinental Railroad. Construction started in 1863, with the Union Pacific building west and the Central Pacific building east. When they finally met at Promontory Summit, Utah in 1869, travel time across the country dropped from 6 months to just 1 week. The ping on the server just got a whole lot better. But with vast open spaces and zero moderation, the West became a 24/7 PvP zone. Law and order were practically non-existent. Legendary griefers like Jesse James, Butch Cassidy, and the Sundance Kid robbed trains and banks because, well, who was going to stop them? To counter this, towns hired moderators, lawmen like Wyatt Earp and Pat Garrett, or private security firms like the Pinkerton Detective Agency. It was a violent, chaotic time where disputes were settled with lead rather than lawsuits. But while the settlers were playing cowboys and robbers, they were ignoring the fact that they were building their houses on someone else's grave. Now, while the settlers were busy playing cowboys and robbers and mining gold, we need to talk about the original inhabitants of the server. You see, all this free real estate wasn't actually free. It was already occupied by hundreds of Native American nations who had been living there for millennia. In the spirit of their founding principles, liberty, equality, and justice, the U.S. government signed multiple treaties promising to protect native lands. It sounds nice, right? Well, in 1830, President Andrew Jackson decided that promises were just suggestions. He passed the Indian Removal Act, which effectively took a Sharpie and crossed out every single previous treaty. The government made their intentions crystal clear. They wanted the land around the Appalachian Mountains, and they didn't care who was living on it. The 5 major tribes in the region, the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw, were served an eviction notice and ordered to move west of the Mississippi. What followed is known as the Trail of Tears, and it is exactly as horrific as it sounds. Tens of thousands of people were forcibly marched westwards under abysmal conditions. Thousands died on the route. This wasn't relocation, it was a death march. And this duplicity became the defining feature of America's expansion strategy well into the 20th century. But don't think the native nations just rolled over and accepted their fate. As the U.S. kept pushing its borders, tribes that refused to leave decided to stand and fight for their way of life. The Sioux and Apache nations, in particular, went into full boss mode, offering dogged resistance against the invaders. In the Great Sioux War of 1876, legendary leaders like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse even managed to humiliate the U.S. Army at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Down south, the Apache leader Geronimo led bands of warriors on raids across Arizona and New Mexico, proving to be an absolute nightmare for American targets. The U.S. government responded the only way they knew how, by spamming military forts across the frontier to house more troops. Ultimately, it was a numbers game. The overwhelming technological and military superiority of the United States meant that the remaining native peoples were subdued. They were forced onto reservations to make way for more settlers, effectively becoming prisoners in their own homeland. With the original owners locked away, the U.S. needed more bodies to fill the map, and they knew exactly where to shop for them. So, who exactly was grinding XP to build this massive server? If you watch old Hollywood westerns, you would think the American West was built exclusively by rugged white dudes named Clint or John. But that is just the devs whitewashing the texture pack. The reality of the workforce was way more diverse. As the 19th century rolled on, millions of Europeans, specifically the Irish and Germans, flooded the lobby, fleeing poverty and political drama in their own servers to seek a fresh start in the U.S. But they weren't the only ones carrying the team. Let's talk about the Chinese. Thousands of Chinese immigrants crossed the Pacific to participate in the gold rush and, more importantly, to do the back-breaking work of constructing the Central Pacific Railroad. They literally laid the tracks for America's future, often under terrible conditions, only to get practically zero credit in the patch notes. And here's a stat that will ruin your childhood memories of Western movies. Black cowboys. After the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, thousands of African Americans moved west to find work. And they didn't just hang around, they became the backbone of the cattle industry. In fact, it is estimated that 25% of all cowboys during this period were African American. That's right, 1 in 4. Yet somehow, Hollywood managed to forget to include them in almost every movie for 100 years. With the workforce sorted, the U.S. decided it was time to check out the DLC store for some overseas territories. First up, the ice level. In 1867, the government purchased Alaska from Russia. At first, everyone laughed and called it a frozen wasteland inhabited only by fur trappers. But in the late 1890s, the Yukon gold rush hit, and suddenly 100,000 prospectors realized that the frozen north was actually a loot cave filled with gold. Russia is probably still smashing their keyboard over that sale. Next up, the beach episode. Far out in the Pacific, American missionaries had arrived in Hawaii in the 1820s to convert the locals. But soon, American businessmen realized that saving souls was less profitable than growing pineapples and sugar. Supported by an aggressive foreign policy, these businessmen started meddling in Hawaiian politics until they eventually just overthrew the kingdom. The U.S. annexed the entire archipelago in 1898, proving that there is no problem that can't be solved by stealing an island for its fruit industry. With the map fully expanded from the Arctic to the tropics, the U.S. was finally ready to consolidate its power. As the 20th century dawned, the admins finally decided to patch the game and fix the borders. The Wild West server, once a chaotic land of opportunity and lawlessness, was officially shutting down. The rapid advances in technology and the mass influx of people had made the vast American West feel a whole lot smaller. Federal control now extended over the entire map like a wet blanket. The great gold, silver, and oil rushes were coming to an end, replaced by boring urban development and zoning laws. The Native Americans, having lost their lands and their wars, were described by the government as having reconciled themselves to U.S. rule. Reconciled is a very polite way of saying had absolutely no other choice left. The final pieces of the puzzle were snapped into place. Oklahoma joined the chat in 1907. New Mexico and Arizona finally got their invites in 1912. And although Alaska and Hawaii were hanging out in the lobby for a while, they didn't receive formal statehood until as late as 1959. With that, the Western American frontier had finally been tamed. The United States had successfully hacked the map, eliminated the competition, and unlocked the superpower achievement. So, the next time you look at a map of the United States, don't just see lines and states. See the deals, the wars, the broken treaties, and the sheer, unadulterated audacity that built a nation. It wasn't just manifest destiny. It was the most successful server takeover in history. Game over. Thanks for playing.